Emily Martin has taught anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, Yale University, Johns Hopkins University, Princeton University, and currently at NYU, or New York University. She has served on the board of directors of the Social Science Research Council and as president of the American Ethnological Society. Her research has been supported by Fulbright Awards, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and grants from the National Science Foundation, the Social Research Council, and the Spencer Foundation. She has done research on Chinese culture and society, which she published in The Cult of the Dead in a Chinese Village by Stanford University Press, Chinese Ritual and Politics, Cambridge University Press, and The Anthropology of Taiwanese Society, co-edited with Hill Gates, published by Stanford University Press. Based on her research in conceptions and practices of the body, the mind, and work, health, and personhood in American culture, she published The Woman in the Body, a Cultural Analysis of Reproduction, Flexible Bodies, Tracking Immunity in America from the Days of Polio to the Age of AIDS. It's another book, Beacon Press. And Bipolar Expeditions, Mania and Depression in American Culture, which many of you have in this audience, published by Princeton University Press. Bipolar Expeditions is affiliated with a website intended to provoke readers' engagement and participation, and you can find this website at www.livecrazy.org. Emily Martin is the founding editor of the public interest magazine Anthropology Now. You can find it online too at www.anthronow.com, sponsored by the American Ethnological Association, funded in part by the Wenna Grant Foundation, and published by Paradigm Publishers. With Louis Sass and Elizabeth Lumbeck, Martin co-organizes the regional seminar, the Picenses Project, if I'm spelling it correctly, and if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the Mind and Brain as understood. The Picenses Project brings clinicians into dialogue with academics around common interests in mind and brain as understood by disciplines such as psychology, psychiatry, psychopharmacology in cultural and historical context. Please help me in welcoming Professor Emily Martin to this audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Majid, for inviting me and for giving me such a wonderful introduction and being such a gracious host. I would also like to add my thanks to his for the help given by Elizabeth Bennett and Neil Jandro, who make all these practical arrangements that help us have this event. I'm honored to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to a broader audience than I usually get to speak to. I, as he indicated, really value breaking the gates of the Academy open a bit and welcoming others in, and hopefully speaking and writing and talking in such a way that what goes on in our college classrooms could be hopefully one day maybe found to be a little bit relevant to people's lives. I think it's incredibly important and really value what the center here is doing. I also have a daughter who's now approaching 30, who went to college at Colby. And so I really treasure Portland and the whole state of Maine, because we had so many wonderful times here celebrating birthdays and graduations and going on hikes and every other kind of thing, spending vacations in the summer. So it's a pure delight to be back here. I hope you've come this evening out of some interest in how and curiosity in the question of how our knowledge about mental states, especially those that are considered to be abnormal, is produced. So I take it as a question from the start: what is that knowledge that we come to have or look up on the web or hear from doctors about mental states? And what gives certain kinds of knowledge about our mental states authority? Why do we believe this account and don't believe that account? Why do we behave according to this recommendation or suggestion and not according to that one? And I'm going to be focusing on mood disorders, which is one of the major categories of mental disorders, in the world of such things, especially bipolar disorder. And my interest is, as an anthropologist, is in looking at the relationship between mood disorders, bipolar disorders, as it's now called. It used to be called manic depression or manic depressive disorder, illness. The relationship between this category of the mind and American culture, which is a very specific, historically specific phenomenon, right? We live in a particular place with a particular history, with a certain set of values, and not that we all agree, but there's a certain framework within which we debate questions of life and death. So I'm trying to bridge the one thing, the historical foundation of American culture, and the other, the medical and broader, more broadly speaking, not just medical, but many other realms try to characterize what this strange thing called a mood disorder is like. And so, to begin with a teaser, this is a story from about a year ago from the Chicago Sun-Times, which claims and attests to a serious, impressive study that Americans are more likely to develop bipolar disorder than any other country in the world. Now, I hope that makes you wonder, well, who says so? What leads to this kind of statistical burgeoning of the diagnosis in the American context? And that's kind of the framework from which I began to do this research that I'll be talking about. And so just so that I know all of you come from many, many different kinds of walks of life. Some of you are in the medical world, some of you are not. Some of you have friends, relatives, colleagues, roommates who have been touched by mood disorders. Some of you do not. I want to make it clear what my talk is based on, because I'm a real empiricist. I don't just make stuff up. I go out there and I try to find out what's going on. And that's what I'm reflecting, not my opinion necessarily, but what I find to be the case. So I want you to see the places where I went in trying to track an understanding of the American cultural situation and bipolar disorder. I'm not going to talk about this in detail at all for lack of time, but it involved a lot of field work with pharmaceutical marketers and sales agents along the Route 1 corridor in New Jersey. Endless attending of support groups for people with bipolar disorder. And here I have to tell you that before I started this research, I got this diagnosis myself. And so when I started the ethnography, which is basically like, you could think of primatology. Ethnography is really like a primatologist going into the rainforest and trying to study the monkeys, only in this case, the objects of the study are just folks like, you, me, regular people, and you hang out. It's called deep hanging out. You hang out not for a day, but for a really long period of time. You don't necessarily interview, but you listen really carefully to what's going on, and you try to observe patterns, themes that repeat in the different contexts you can get access to. And so in the support groups, which were only accessible to those with such a diagnosis, I could be there because I had the diagnosis. And I would always say, I'm also a researcher, I'm an anthropologist, and I'm doing a study. Is it okay if I'm here? Because it's a really important ethical issue. And all of the groups that I went to said, they sort of paused for a moment, and then they said, well, I guess we all wear more than one hat, and I guess you wear two hats. One, you have this diagnosis, and another, you're an anthropologist, so it's okay. So I was able to do that very, very important part of the field work. And then also, I was allowed to be in a university psychiatry department with the status there of a medical student. I could sit in rounds of various kinds and analytic case conferences. And I will say a little bit about this later. I also went to places where pharmaceutical industry employees were being trained to be good employees. And you would think, well, what has that got to do with mood disorders? But you'll see, I promise you, by the end. Okay, so what's the project? I feel it's important to not only say where I get the data, but what the project is, because there's so many different ways that something like bipolar disorder could be talked about. I'm interested in a landscape of meaning situated in a particular cultural history. There's a phrase, imagined communities, that comes from Benedict Anderson's attempt to understand nation states, and especially emerging nation states. And this means not what communities such as nation states are, in fact, but what they hope to be, what they aspire to be, what they might imagine themselves one day to be. And you can hear this aspiration in reports today from the Arab Spring, from Egypt, Libya, Syria, that there are aspirations that aren't achieved yet, but that are able to be articulated. And so I'm always trying to listen for that kind of, we can imagine it, but we're not there yet, or this is how things might be, even though my life doesn't match that imagined landscape. That's one thing. The second thing is, I'm not out to critique clinical practice. I have observed a lot of clinical practice situations, but I'm really not so much after critiquing it than to open up different questions than the ones that are addressed in medical school that might be useful in clinical settings, that might open up things that could be profitable for the doctor-patient relationship. And I am therefore starting really from the opposite end. If you think of mood disorder in a person with mood disorder, a person with bipolar as a diagnosis, sitting in a psychiatrist's office being dealt with in a clinical setting, that's the opposite end from where I start. I'm starting in somebody's home or in a support group where the person goes on a Saturday morning, or in a workplace setting where they're having trouble because of their volatile moods. So I'm starting from the opposite end and trying to bridge from those everyday situations over to something that might be useful for a clinician. I've come up with this phrase, living under the description of bipolar disorder, as a way of dealing with the question which I get all the time, is bipolar disorder biological? Is it a biological condition, or is it culturally constructed? Now, those of you who are in the academy know about this cultural construction thing. My opinion, my opinion about this is that everything human is both biological and culturally constructed, and that it is probably a fool's errand to try to tease the two apart in any definitive way. So the phrase is meant to treat to resist the apparent necessity of such a choice, is it this or that, to reject the choice, and to say that both sides of this apparent dichotomy are real, both are material, both are symbolic, and both are filled with the ability or desire to imagine a world. I worry that talking about bipolar disorder as culturally constructed might lead one to ignore the very real material effects of this diagnosis, this and any diagnosis, especially psychiatric ones. A psychiatric diagnosis is a material fact. If you get one, and it's a major one, it has immediate material effects on employment, insurance, life expectancy, admission to all kinds of contexts. So it's not culturally constructed exactly. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's real, it's material, it has effects. And that's what the phrase is meant to acknowledge. The other thing it's meant to acknowledge is that under the description, if I had a tree here, I don't, but if I did, and I asked you to describe the tree, if I asked 3 people to describe the tree, the 3 descriptions would probably be 3 different things. One might talk about the leaves, another the bark, another the roots, another the flowers. So a person, a thing, an entity can be described in many, many different ways. So I'm trying to say the person with the diagnosis, bipolar disorder, that's one description among many. And that's what I want to try to help us keep in mind. And to do that, we have to put this diagnosis, which seems all-encompassing. It's like if you have a relative or you yourself or a friend who gets this diagnosis, it's like they move from normal to abnormal and their whole being goes with it. No, this is just crazy. Speaking of crazy, that's crazy. It's just crazy. No, it's one description. It captures one element of the person, not the whole person. And so it's incredibly important to keep in mind that although that's a very powerful move, it's very, has a great deal of material effects, it is not the only thing that the person is. And in order to see that, we have to put that description, bipolar disorder, in a larger cultural and historical context. So I'm going to give you 3 little examples to start us off to give you an idea of what kind of thing I mean by that. This is the first one. This is from New York Magazine. This was the magazine issue that claimed that, well, basically all New Yorkers are bipolar. Because, why is that? Well, because we don't sleep, we're always active, we do 10 things at once, we have 3 different jobs, we're rushing around like crazy people, we walk really fast, our eyes dart like this. And actually, it's kind of true in a way. If you've probably all been to New York, but if you've been away from New York and then you go back there, you're like, it is like manic. And so what they're picking up in the magazine is not nothing. It's something. It's what I would call it is a style. It's learned. When you first go to New York, your legs hurt like you would not believe because you're pounding the pavement. You're walking faster than you've ever walked in your life. And before long, you're used to that. And you just, like everybody else, you just stride down the sidewalk, like at 15 miles an hour or something like that. And you don't even think about it anymore. You learn it. It's a learned style. And so I would just as a hint, like to say that a style is a style. It can be learned, it can be unlearned, it can be profitable, it can be unprofitable. It is not the core of your being. So part of this bipolar thing is style. Just remember that. Style is like what you wear. You can take it off, you can put it on, okay? It doesn't mean that you are a bipolar thing. And this is my main message. It means you have elements of your personality and behavior that are captured by this description. The second example is, this is from the Saturday Evening Post. This is Ted Turner, of course. And on the left, you see him as a sober, careful, judicious CEO behind the podium. And on the right, there's the manic grin. He's, at the helm of a yacht, running a race, and you see the 2 sides of him. He is said to be living under the description of bipolar disorder, although when I first said that in print many years ago, I got a call from his publicist who said, you better retract that or you're going to have a lawsuit in your hands, which I thought was very interesting on many different accounts. So maybe he is or maybe he isn't, but it's frequently said that he is. It's also interesting that if you can read the caption, can you read the caption? The caption says that after the Wall Street Journal profiled him as bipolar, which they did, his competitors took note that he was not taking his lithium. And what that meant was that, what? What does it mean when a bipolar person's not taking their lithium anymore? And in your Ted Turner, it means watch out, the next CNN, the next something big, the next big idea, the next creative thing is going to mushroom out of this man's crazy mind. Crazy but creative, right? So it's tapping into this feeling that there's some huge resource there that we better worry about. Okay, my third little example. How many of you have watched Homeland? Oh, not too many. Oh, poor Showtime. Oh, wow. Well, you have to subscribe to Showtime. I understand. It's, like not at the top of the list for, unless you're, a popular culture freak like I am. But I recommend it, however, when it comes out on DVD or Netflix or something. It's about, the actress that you see there is Claire Danes, and she plays a CIA agent who's on the track of a really threatening terrorist event that hasn't happened yet. And the man in this picture is her former boss, Saul Berenson. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because she is revealed in the program to be bipolar. And this is a big plot element because on the 11th episode of the 12, there are only 12 in the series, the 11th episode of the 12, she's not only revealed to be bipolar, but she has an incredible manic episode. And she gathers together all of the bits and pieces of data concerning this impending terrorist event and color codes them with magic markers, with highlighters, red, green, pink, purple, blue. And it's just an incredible chaotic mess on her living room floor. Just floods of paper, all different colors, magic marker, different colors. And she ends up in the hospital because it's just complete chaos. And so she's bipolar, she's created complete chaos, everything's color-coded. And then her old boss, Saul, the gentleman there in the picture, has this thought, he sort of has this thought that any of you might have, well, maybe she's not really crazy. Maybe something's going on here that we could learn from. And so he simply gathers together all the bits of paper according to color. He puts the pinks with the pinks, the purples with the purple, da-da-da-da, tacks it up on the bulletin board, as you see in this picture, and lo and behold, she has revealed a timeline, which reveals the whole entire complexity of the plot and therefore what is going to happen next. And I can't tell you what happens because they cut it off before, obviously before the end so we'll tune in next time. But it's a very interesting depiction of bipolar disorder. A very powerful link is being made between creativity. She saw something that was almost impossible to see in the massive data, which didn't reveal itself. And at the same time, she was so disordered in her behavior that she had to be thrown in the hospital. And she eventually was given ECT. So the link here in all of these three cases I'm giving you as beginning tidbits is between some kind of disordered mood, something wrong with your mood sequence, cycle, range, and creativity and success. It works and it doesn't work. It works and it doesn't work. It's great and it's horrible. So how can those things go together? And that's the puzzle that I tried to sort out in this research. Okay, so the talk is in 4 parts, and I think it will be over I've been talking now for 10 minutes. I think it will be over in 30 more minutes, so you can kind of gauge your attention. The first part is a link between motivation and mood. Now, mood, okay, what comes to mind when you think of a mood? Oh, he's in a mood. Bad mood, good mood. I don't know, just think that. Think for a moment in that space. Now think what comes to mind when you think of motivation. It's quite different, isn't it? It's really a different, those are the 4 parts. A different set of associations go with motivation than with mood. Well, start with motivation. A motivation is linear, it's directed, it's going to go somewhere, it involves agency, it's got a goal. Okay? A mood is more likely to be mercurial, shifting, fluctuating, drifting, comes and goes, wafts in and out, moves all over the place. So what are the two doing together? And how are they together? Well, let me show you the official account. This is from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the huge book that every doctor has on his or her desk, which has in it the criteria for diagnosing patients with one mental disorder or another. And it's a very powerful book because every diagnosis is associated with a number. And if you come under one of these descriptions and you go to a doctor and the doctor wants to give you a prescription that you hope to get paid back from your insurance for, you have to have a number from the DSM. It's that legally binding. You don't have a number, you won't get repaid from your insurance, from the pharmaceutical benefit. So it's very powerful, the categories in which people's behaviors have to be fitted. So here's the DSM. Under mania, it links these traits, which I would say are connected to motivation, continuous wakefulness, excessive involvement in pleasurable activities, increasingly goal-directed activity. And for depression, it's the opposite, lack of motivation, marked diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities, and fatigue or loss of energy. So what is manic depression, bipolar disorder, mania, and depression? Is it a bundle of moods or a bundle of motivations? It's actually a combination of both. And it's once you see this, it begins to untangle this historically very complex and loaded. It's like a shell with barnacles on it. It's picked up these different associations through time, and it's come down to us as involving both things having to do with mood and things having to do with motivation. So over time, a person who has this diagnosis is liable to experience both motivation and moods as, on the one hand, too high, and on the other hand, too low. You have a person who's pursuing their interests too avidly, not sleeping, maybe holding down 3 jobs or opening 3 businesses or whatever, followed by a lack of motivation, lethargic immobility, sleeping all the time, unable to even shower. I think it is the heightened motivation that people in the United States associate with mania that accounts for people's bemused affection for the condition. At least in college audiences, when I described mania, in the DSM formula, not sleeping, working all the time, having ideas just springing out of your head like crazy, people smile, especially professors smile, and they nod. And I know what they're thinking is, well, I'm a little bit like that. Everyone would like to be a little bit like that, creative, energetic, font of new ideas, and so on. And it has to do with this trait of the high value that we place on motivation, at least in certain walks of life. Okay, but this link between motivation and mood has changed historically, which tells us it's not rooted in some kind of bare biological facts. And we can see this by looking at a form of data which has been important to me, which is the mood chart. How many of you have ever heard of a mood chart? This is an unknown term. Mood charts? You don't know mood charts? Oh, come on. You must know mood charts. Mood charts are all over the place. They're in magazines, they're in newspapers, they're on self-help sites, they're on web pages. Your doctor might give you one. It's how you manage a mood disorder. You get yourself a mood chart, and then you take careful note of the changes in your moods over time in relation to lots of other things, as we'll see. And what I'm interested in is how the details of this little apparatus, like a little technology, has changed over time. So I'm going to show you a really old one and a really new one. The old one is on the left, and this is from the 18th century, from Benjamin Rush. This was printed in a book, and it was recommended to be hung on the fireplace within reach of all the members of the household. Okay, so take a look at that one, and tell me where you would like to be. The moral thermometer. Where would you like to be? At the top? At the bottom? In the middle? Whoa, we don't have a consensus here. That's really interesting. I would think most people wouldn't want to be ungovernable at the top, and most people wouldn't want to be quite stupid at the bottom. And we might like to be kind of in the middle, temperate or warm but reasonable, right? It kind of directs you to be in the middle, right? Okay, now look at the one on the right-hand side. This is a recent one. It's a web-based mood chart, and you can move the slider up and down. But when I've asked people where they would like to be on this one, although normal is in the middle, if you can see that on the right-hand side, at the bottom of the slider on the right of the two is extremely active. And everybody says, oh, I want to be there. Extremely active. That's good. I definitely want to be there. That means, productive, creative, generating ideas, generating productivity, doing stuff. That's definitely where I want to be. At least in my work life, my college students, brag, tell stories, apocryphal or not, about not sleeping, about being up all night, about taking more courses than they're supposed to, about using stimulants to keep themselves up on the edge, to getting them from their friends if they don't have a prescription. It's undergraduate life is a culture of the hyper, It's to be hyper is to be kind of normal now, and at least in my New York environment, I have to bear that in mind that it is New York. But still, you sort of, do you get the point of the contrast? Okay. Now I want to look at this from another point of view, from the point of view of the workplace. This is a public health poster, and it was to increase awareness of depression, because of course that's a diagnosis that people had to be educated that it existed, so that those who were afflicted by this really terrible condition could get help. And you see in the picture, it's a workplace, a sort of open workplace. I don't know if you can make it out, but there are several figures who are made of plaster. They're made of white plaster. Those are the depressed people, right? They're immobile. They cannot move. They are not able to work. They are depressed. So there's this, in many other cases, a very strong association between depression and being unproductive. On the other end of things, to be manic is to be highly and creatively productive. The left-hand image is an ad for Netscape, when Netscape still existed, but I still use this ad because it's so perfect. It's pictures of a rave, a dance party with drugs involved, juxtaposed with the floor of the Wall Street, the trading floor. And it's all about being manic. It's all about, being hyper-energized and striving for something beyond the norm for success in one realm or the other. The picture on the right is from my field work. This is a company that is running worker training sessions, mostly for the pharmaceutical industry, but not only, in which is called, it's a mad, 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 mad world. That's what the training is called. And I did this and also worked for them. And workers come and they're meant to undergo an experience of mania. And the idea is they'll undergo an experience of mania and then they'll carry that back to the workplace so that they can recreate it in the workplace and tap into the higher creativity and productive values of being manic. And how do you make somebody manic? Like you have a day, and you've got one day to create mania in a random group of people who've come from the New Jersey Route 1 corridor. Well, they have it down to a science. What they do is run a contest, kind of like a scavenge hunt, with a list of things that you can get points for. And you go out into the city, wherever you may be, and try to get these things and come back, and then there's a competition. But the things on the list are not like, I don't know, what would a scavenger hunt have? Like a Starbucks coffee cup or a broken chair, whatever, sort of random, odd, ordinary things. All the things on the list are borderline illegal or embarrassing. As you see here, they borrowed a mannequin from a department store and brought it back, and they got mega points for that. Another big ticket item was a toilet. So how do you get a toilet from downtown Boston? Well, I'm here to tell you that some of the teams did it. A hotel employee's ID card. Everything that was on the list was somehow involved some breach of norm or breach of a rule. It was borderline, not quite illegal, not like jail-worthy, but scary. And when the groups came back, they were truly, by any standard, they were manic beyond belief. Shrieking, shouting, running around in circles, gesturing, so excited they could hardly stand it. And this was meant to be carried back to the workplace to benefit the productivity of the company. So the point of all this is that mania, as part of the bipolar condition, has escaped the clinic. It's out there in the world. It's operating, it's doing things, very interesting things in the ordinary world. And this is part of the reason why I showed you this first before showing you things you may have seen before, but I'm going to show you them again so you can kind of put it together with this. The innumerable, and I have many more than I'm going to show you, innumerable instances of creativity of a person who's creative, productive, interesting, and exciting who is also bipolar. The combination, the sort of mad genius combination is all over the place. So here are some examples. This is a Scientific American article which collects together a bunch of historical figures. I won't go into that in detail, but I'm sure you can pick up the idea. Teddy Roosevelt, in a fairly recent introductory textbook, is suddenly discovered to have been manic depressive. It was never said before, but now it's beginning to be said, looking back, that historical figures, they must have been manic depressive because they had some of these traits. Robin Williams, very commonly a figure in this light. Richard Branson, another successful CEO. Steve Jobs, frequently associated with mania. Dove Charney, American Apparel. You have American Apparel up here. It's a sort of cutting edge LA kind of hip clothing company with this very manic style CEO. Ted Turner again, the corporealized spirit of the age, the man of the year by GQ. And very recently, manic depression has been called the CEO's disease. And there's more and more literature about, I would add college presidents actually, but there's more and more association between highly placed individuals in the corporate world and some of these traits. This is not to say that people really ought to be diagnosed and medicated. Do you understand? It's not that they are necessarily ought to be, institutionalized or medicated or anything, but it's that there's a style that's being associated with certain kinds of important behavioral capacities. And this is historically specific, I would say, a certain kind of creative productivity that's desired especially by high-tech industries that are, if you think about it, high-tech industries require constant creative innovation. They require a kind of drive to be able to constantly change and even anticipate change before it has happened. And the idea is that this style could help workers stay on the edge of new discoveries and be energetic enough to do this kind of thing. Of course, there's a cost to this. When my students brag about how they don't sleep and they take drugs to stay on the edge all the time, there's a cost to that, Can you really thrive as a person while not sleeping? Do you really learn that much from your classes while doing that kind of driven, energetic outpouring of energy? And in the corporate world, the demand to be constantly innovative and constantly changing in your ideas and your products has come along with the loss of permanent careers, the loss of jobs, the loss of many forms of social safety nets that allowed us to relax. Who can relax anymore? It's really remarkable. And the denial of financial crises and so on. So anyway, there's a dark side to these wonderful aspects of the manic style that I think is important to remember. The second part is back to the phenomenon of charting moods, because this is important because an anthropological question is how does any of these characteristics get taken up by people? How does anybody come to see themselves as bipolar or depressed or manic or anything? How does it happen that any of us would own any of these descriptions? How would we do that? And I think one of the ways this happens is through the very tiny, small technology of the mood chart, which is given to patients to take home. And once you've done mood charting for a while, you have oriented your life. It only takes 5 minutes, but during that 5 minutes, you've oriented your whole life around the category of bipolar disorder. You've noted your sleep, your medications, your activities, your moods, your relationships, your walking the dog. Everything is encompassed within the circle of this category, the mood disorder. So I've tried to pay close attention to them. This one is a very ordinary one. You can see it's rather complex, right? This is 1 month, and the days march down the middle from 1 to 31. And on the left-hand side is all devoted to medications, what you've taken, what you haven't taken. And on the right-hand side, it's work, productivity, mood, and relationships. When people reflect on their moods and fill out mood charts, I think their subjectivity is changed. And to give you some historical perspective on this, I want again to go back in time to the turn of the century when Emil Kraepelin, who first divided up mental disorders between schizophrenia and manic depressive illness, he called it, and made the great division between mental disorders was made by him around the turn of the century. And he had thousands of patients, and doctors kept mood charts on their patients back in this early time. And so people aren't filling them out themselves back then, but the doctors are filling them out anyway. And what's striking about this example of 4 different people's mood charts is that each one of these rectangular blocks is an entire lifetime. That's the moods of 4 different people over a lifetime. The red, obviously, is mania. The blues are depression. There's a little code for the hatch marks and so on. But it's a very compact rendering of moods over a lifetime. The time scale is condensed. And in spite of the fact that Kraepelin's view was that this was a progressive, downward-headed disease that would never get better ultimately, he had a very depressing view of manic depression. In spite of that, there's something that's not so depressing about his mood charts. Something that's different from the contemporary ones where you saw Amy's chart for one entire month. And that is that he himself, Kraepelin, described long, lucid intervals when patients were, quote, able to re-enter the family, employ themselves profitably, and return to their profession. And those are the spaces that are neither red nor blue. Lots of them, right? These are just 4. There are dozens in the book. When I showed this very slide to an audience at the University of Texas in Austin, a woman from the audience stood up at the questions, and she said, I am a person, she said after my lecture, living under the description of bipolar disorder. I'm from the community, she said. And she said, thank you for giving me the white spaces. I'm going to go home and just be in a white space. This meant a place where her moods were not disordered and she did not have to monitor them constantly on a daily basis when she could just be in a white space. And I think that's the difference. If the constant monitoring, constantly encompassing your whole life experience in relation to the category has an effect on the subjective experience. So now I'm going to show you a variety of, just so you don't have to take my word for it, you can now see a variety of different forms these mood charts take. Here are some from pharmaceutical companies who have drugs they would like all of us to, not all of us, but many of us to buy, and they would like us to monitor our moods. And so, there's a couple more examples I forgot from Kraepelin, even more white spaces. Now here's Zyprexa's mood chart on the web. You move another slider, you move along, and the corporation will collect the data for you and produce a little graph for you so you can see how you're doing. And of course, you're going to monitor your moods in relation to whether or not you're taking Zyprexa, right? So there's the pharmaceutical industry. There's the government. This is from an NIMH study of mood disorders. This is a very complicated, almost impenetrable chart, but it's the same idea. I think you can see the drugs on the one side and the moods on the other and the day-by-day noting. And this one is my favorite. This is from an elementary school. So the children are supposed to move the apples around according to how they are. In the middle is okay, right? I mean, this is pretty amazing. I don't want to take the time to go into it in detail, but frenzy at the top, suicide at the bottom, mood disorder. I mean, it's and the apples are meant to be, a way for the child to comprehend. They're like color forms. They're plastic stick-on apples that you can move and stick for the child to comprehend the kinds of things that are at stake. So compared to Kreppelin's old charts, the contemporary ones have undergone a huge elaboration. The entire life, in Kreppelin's case, described on a half a page. Today, 1 page would contain at most a month at most. And that is a speed up. I'm going to tell you, I figured this out. From a year per page, if we had a year per page to a day per page, and we have actually more than that, but a year per page to a day per page is a speed up of more than 10,000-fold. So the detail with which this scrutiny is being offered and taken up is intense. It's also important that these mood charts contain a great emphasis on the drugs that a person is taking in relation to how their moods are, and the relationship is what is important. So another company, this one I showed you an image of before, offers a way to chart. Doctors can buy this software package and have patients fill it out, log on to it at home, and then the doctor can log in and see how the patient is doing with the medication taken and the mood response, so they can track remotely what is going on. I think one effect of all this scrutiny, the detailed scrutiny from many different directions, is that it emphasizes the abnormal. It makes you focus on what's wrong. It makes you focus on how your behavior fits into a framework of the disease, the disordered. Of course, you could choose to be in the middle. You could choose to be at the zero in any of these charts. You could be just a flat line. But no one ever does. I'm here to tell you no one ever does. And I began to understand how this was at one of the fieldwork sessions I had at a support group, where the way the groups begin is often, it's kind of like AA, only it's not the AA model. Each person introduces themselves, and then they say how they're doing in their moods. So you'll say, I'm Jan, and I'm +3. I'm Emily, and I'm -1. I'm Dave, and I'm +4. This is sort of an imaginary chart from 0 up to +5 and down to -5. And most of the people in the group had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, so that everybody was somewhere up or somewhere down. But one time, a member brought along her husband. He doesn't have manic depression or bipolar disorder, and I saw him looking there like his eyes were like, oh my God, deer in the headlights, what am I going to say? We got to him, and he says, I'm Brad, and I guess I must be 0. So the only 0 in the room was somebody who didn't have the diagnosis, and he felt he could say, I'm not on that chart. I'm normal. I'm just me. I'm just Brad. I'm a 0. And that made me understand how powerful the effect of the diagnosis is on one's subjectivity. Okay, the third part of the talk is about drugs and the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And just briefly, drugs are, they're a technology. They're powerful. They can be very useful. But they are used by people like, what would be a good analogy? If you were on a desert island and all you had was a hammer, you could do so many things with that hammer. You could hammer nails with it. You could pry stuff up with it. You could dig a hole with it. Just think of all the things you could do with that single tool, even though it was meant just to hammer nails. Drugs are like that. People use them very actively and creatively and empirically. And I was at a conference at UCLA where a psychiatrist said, here's my maxim about psychotropic drugs. He said, people take drugs any way they want to. And it's true. People take drugs any way they want to. And it's a good thing. Physicians don't know exactly what the effects of drugs are, together or alone. And people do know a lot from their own personal experience of taking drugs. And they are active in figuring out what works for them and what does not. There's a huge amount of empirical experimenting, I guess you could say, with drugs in combination and alone. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a tremendous emphasis on high technology drugs. This is an ad from an advertising magazine for the advertising industry, but it captures the sense in which what people deeply and highly value is new drugs, highly technologically engineered. And there are a great many of them, and they're also very expensive. So it creates a difficulty for people who can't afford necessarily all of the most high-tech, newest drugs. And it creates a problem for an old drug like lithium, which is very old. In fact, I don't know if there are any spas in Maine with hot springs that are lithium springs, but there are some in Maryland, I know, I've been to them, where the waters have lithium in them. And in the 19th century, people went to spas, boiling water spas with mineral content and drank the waters. You've heard of this, right? So if you went to a spa, a healing spa, and drank the waters from the lithium pool, which, I don't know what's in it, but they say there's lithium in it. So that's lithium. That's the lithium that we give to patients today. It's the very same mineral, although it's in a different form, obviously. But patients strongly prefer the high-tech drugs over the old drugs. And this has important costs, not only material costs, but it has a cost to the welfare of the patient, because the new drugs do not necessarily have all of the benefits that these simple old drugs had. So I just throw that out for those of you who have who know somebody who's struggling with some of these issues. And the last thing is the ubiquity of such drugs, which I could say a great deal more about. This is a Roz Chast cartoon. She's playing with us here, making fun, substituting the DSM categories with her own, the winter doldrums, Valentine vigor, hay fever, and she's got a drug for every month, pill of month club. But I think she makes the point that is well taken, that these kinds of drugs have wormed their way into life in a most phenomenal and profound way. And I think she's also making fun of the DSM, that Bible of the categories. And it's often castigated, the DSM, for being very sort of blocky and rigid, and having categories into which you must be put when I don't fit that category completely, and I'm over here and it's over there. But I have also learned in various ways that the DSM can be helpful. And I want to just tell you one brief incident at a support group. When I first was going to them, I thought, as an anthropologist who'd worked in other cultures, I thought a support group would be where people bared their soul. I thought people would reveal their deepest thoughts and their most private feelings and all that kind of thing, and I was going to be there to hear it all, and that would be my field work. And so the first group I went to, when it came to my turn to share, I told about something that had happened to me the week before, which I thought was appropriate to the occasion, which involved a person in my professional life who gave a formal talk like this, and I was sitting in the audience like you are, and she was reading her paper, and she read from my work without quoting me or acknowledging me in any way. And I had this feeling of unreality, like this can't be happening. It was a really profound, sort of a stomach-dropping sensation. And for the few days after that, I had a visual experience of my visual field, sort of like a movie screen. If you can imagine a movie screen rent down the middle, and behind was just black. So if that screen were rent down the middle and behind was just black. So for several days, I went around with this strange visual experience. Well, I thought, well, I drove. It was, I figured, well, this is kind of weird. But so I told the support group about this. Total dead silence followed. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I thought that's what you're supposed to do here. And afterwards, they took me aside and they said, look, this is not what we do here. You never tell that kind of thing. You never, ever tell that kind of thing. And one guy took me into a gazebo in private, and he said, I'm an Amtrak engineer, and I have visions, not that one, but I have visions too. And you never tell about that. And so I understood then that the DSM categories, so what I was supposed to say is, I'm bipolar too. And I had an interesting week and skipped the vision part. Just talk about, something that happened in work or a problem I was having. DSM-2 But bipolar 2 is a DSM category that allows me to shield myself from these kinds of sharing these entire kinds of interior experiences that could be very harmful for carrying on with, ordinary life. Okay, so now I'm going to slide to the end with trying to bring it together a little bit because I've talked about mania, I've talked about depression, but this condition, bipolar disorder, its quintessence is the person experiences both over time, both the highs and the lows, not simultaneously, but sequentially over time. That's the quintessence of it. And I've tried to indicate why the high part would be so valued in our particular culture. But this slide is an image from a pharmaceutical exhibit at the big APA conference. And it's an ad for a form of sustained release lithium. And it's a story that's told on kind of posts like this scattered around the huge exhibit floor of a young man who was very successful in college, was very successful in his job. He was terrific Tim, the Wonder Boy, and terrible Tim, who was fired, jumped from a job to job, and got a divorce. He had a catastrophic manic episode and became very scared. And then he got treatment, but he quit his pills. He had a pistol, pills, a razor, and rope around him. He had ecstatic plans that he couldn't really activate realistically. And he tried to commit suicide, but failed. And the story sort of ends at that point, and then this is the last pillar in this story. I'm so brilliant, I'm so confident, I'm so successful, I'm so attractive, I'm so rich, I wish I was dead. It's the two together or in sequence over time. It seems impossible for one person to contain such extreme opposites. But Ted Turner is depicted that way. And the caption also raises the parallel between his life and Ernest Hemingway's life, who also committed suicide. So it raises the question whether this might happen to Ted Turner. And I think the question that I want to leave you with is whether, with this kind of life experience, what do drugs do? Do they ease suffering? With this hugely enlarged role for psychotropic drugs, take care of this problem? Will this be the way that suffering is eased? I want to say that in my experience and in the experience of many people that I did fieldwork with, they do ease suffering. They do ease suffering. They make it better, especially if you have a good healthcare provider to help you titrate the whole thing. But do they heal? That's my last question. Do they heal? They might ease suffering, but do they heal? To heal us, to heal all of us, our cures would have to address not just our experience in this kind of way, crucial as that is, but it would have to address the strong but invincible barriers to our ability to flourish as individuals and part of collectivities. And this is especially intensified when mental illness comes into the picture. And so I would, maybe on the eve of the debate about the healthcare bill at the Supreme Court, just raise the question of healing and what that means, what that should mean for us. And to leave you with this thought, that why does, in the American context, the ability of those with emotional disorders to be emotionally extreme treated as such a resource? Why is that such a resource? An economic resource or a creative resource for those who can take advantage of it? Those Americans who can are being encouraged directly and explicitly encouraged to optimize their extreme moods by filling out a chart or by taking on board the managing presence of a drug. And I want to end with one of my interlocutors from Southern California, the poet C.E. Chaffin, who wrote a poem called Manic Depression, a poem that traces his personal movement from imprisonment in depression to release in mania. The sun rises, stone walls dissolve, I clench a marigold in my teeth and tango on the flaming grass. The soil beneath is black with crematory ash. I pray the lawn is thick enough to hide the darkness I dance for. In the specific social world we inhabit, a world harnessed to the harsh realities and devastating losses entailed by increasingly unfettered capitalism and turning between the poles of emotion and anxiety, mania and depression, the dance here and in the other slide I showed you contains darkness. facing the darkness that is the price is the bright light of mania is perhaps necessary if we are ever to consider alternative ways of living. People living under the description of manic depression have keen experience of this insight, and indeed they cannot avoid it. They cannot help wondering whether the dance will ever be incandescent enough, the lawn thick enough to banish the darkness. This perspective, as much as the wild energy of mania, is the essential resource contained in manic depression. That's the end.
Thank you so much. Now we have the Q&A session begins. Please speak in the microphone if you want to ask a question.
I was wondering how recently you did your research, and if you think the methods that you observed in your book are still being used right now, and how effective you think they are.
Do you mean my methods or the methods of the clinicians and so on?
The methods of the clinicians.
Yes, I believe that nothing has changed. I mean, the book was published in 2007. I did the research for 10 years before that, and I saw the things that I write about, I saw repeatedly. I wonder if you're thinking about the rounds examples, which I didn't talk about. So for the rest of you, there's a chapter in the book about mood disorder rounds where physicians select a patient who exemplifies a diagnosis from the DSM. And the patient is, with consent, brought in to a room. And there is not a huge group. These are fairly small, medical students, doctors, just various people from the medical school. And the idea is to teach the students how to diagnose what is going on. So the patient is interviewed, usually very politely and kindly. There's nothing aggressive about it at all. And then after some fairly lengthy, really good interviewing, the patient goes out. And then the doctors train the students up in how to diagnose. Was he depressed? Was he bipolar? Was he bipolar 1 or bipolar 2? Was he this or that? And the one that what you're probably thinking about is the African-American man who, I'm guessing, it's a long story. I can't go into it here. It would take too much time. But his attempt to present himself as a very successful college student with a high grade point average was displaced over and over and over again. And what the clinicians wanted to say was that he was bipolar. And I'm not a psychiatrist, but I didn't disagree with the diagnosis. But I thought what was striking about it was the way in which this man from a poor African-American community in this city was presenting himself as successful, socially successful, surrounded by his family, having been the sole support for his siblings growing up, and being demonstrating polite behavior from his cultural milieu, such as shaking hands with every single one of us when he first walked into the room. And this was not understood as a polite, a gesture of someone who's polite, a gentleman. People said it was manic, if you see what I mean. So I don't think it was intended, but I think that let's just say, if I can put it neutrally, the ability to decode the social context that was present in the room was not as great as it could be. And I think this is because all the doctors and the students were white, and it's a very prestigious medical school, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody would be white, but everybody was white. And so one doesn't know. So I was trying to get at how devastating this must have been for this young man, and not to kind of complain that he really wasn't bipolar. Does that help? Okay.
Just to build on that question, when you have a person who does have a serious medical problem, such as bipolar, and you're going to use that person in rounds for either teaching purposes or research purposes, how do you take properly informed consent?
To present the person in rounds, to bring them into rounds?
How do you obtain from that person informed consent?
Because they have a serious mental illness and perhaps not the capability to. Isn't that an interesting question? That's an incredibly interesting question. I think my whole starting point with all of this is if the person with such a diagnosis really is not capable of rational behavior, if that's what it means, then they can't give consent, right? Not in the sense that we normally mean consent. So then how can they be presented in rounds? I think that's a just fabulous point. I don't know actually if there is assigned consent. I don't know. Does anybody know if people presented in rounds signing consent? I don't know. My guess, I can't really say that I know that this is true. My guess is if you are an inpatient, which all of these patients were, if you are an inpatient in a psychiatric ward, you've left your personhood at the door, sort of. No?
Microphone, please. Microphone, wait, just microphone.
Treatment purposes, that's correct.
Yeah.
But not for educational purposes such as training other physicians to be, or for research purposes. There's a huge bright line there, and I was just wondering how you addressed it yourself in your own studies.
Well, so you're asking me how I was able to be there? Oh, well, I thought you were asking me how the doctors got the patient in under the proper IRB kinds of approvals. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, whatever they did, I never saw it. I was categorized as a medical student. So if the medical students could be there in the classroom setting, I could be there in the classroom setting. So I was not under any, which I found interesting. They were willing to let me be there under that description. It partly is not all medical schools are alike, and this one is very, it has its ways. I mean, it doesn't necessarily bother about a lot of rules. I mean, I knew enough people so that I was trustworthy in the sense that I was part of a social network. I was a professor at Hopkins I was a professor there for almost 20 years. So I was kind of part of the environment, which probably made them feel like it was okay for me to be there.
Hello.
Hi.
I just had a quick question about, you spoke about how all these drugs and different things bring about solutions to fix like perceived problems on specific symptoms, depression or mania. But what would you think as a possible future progress in actually healing the patients and the people rather than just fixing their mental perceptions?
Well, thank you for that. That's a wonderful question. I won't turn it back to you, but I think in a sense that's what needs to happen. The question needs to be turned back. It's a very important question. It needs to be taken up by collectives, by communities, by the people of Portland, by the people of Baltimore, by neighborhoods, by students in schools, and it needs to be discussed in depth. So I can't give you a general answer. It would be, would be hubris to do that. In my own setting, in a university with college students and graduate students, what I think it would mean, because many of my students have crises around these issues, serious crises, like I'm going to drop out of school crises. And medication is brought in right away, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So what is the solution? Well, in that world, the solution might involve slowing things down. Why does everything have to go at breakneck speed? Can I do that as an individual? Not really. I'm caught in it also, producing, speed up. So how to slow it down? I don't know. I wish I could turn a crank like Charlie Chaplin and slow it down. But maybe the best I can do is to point out to the students who are in this environment where things move at such breakneck speed that that's part of the problem. It's not all them. It's not all their fault, their failing, their personality, their psyche. It's the environment in which they are having to function. And I mean, that's a very weak response, but what really needs doing is changing big parts of the social structure that we live in. Can that happen realistically? I don't know. I hate to be too pessimistic. Safety nets, I think, are enormously important to people's psyche. I don't know why this is so often overlooked, that a student who graduates from NYU, all of you young people in this room, you face a really terrifying job market. What kind of life is that? No careers anymore? This would make anybody insane. I just think it's these structural features that have led us to give up the idea of a pension, the idea of a career, the idea of a job that had continuity and that could be counted on, trusted on, rested on. Those are good things. They're not bad things, signs of failure to produce. So I work hard for workers' rights, for women's rights. I know this sounds very old-fashioned, but I think that's what is needed. More support underneath, so that people don't have to rely on the vagaries of a constantly changing market for any kind of basic security. And if the diagnosis has skyrocketed in the United States, the diagnosis of mood disorder, I mean, can you any longer think of that without thinking about all these other factors, about the press for productivity, the press for constant change and innovation? Did I make you think about that connection? Please tell me that you at least thought about it. So it's not just that the medical profession is pushing into our lives and making us be more diagnosed. And it's not just that the drug companies have more products they want us to buy. That's all true. But it's other stuff, too, coming from the kinds of lives that my two daughters are facing. Just immense insecurity, no matter what kind of training and hard work they've put into preparing. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
I struggled a little bit in the beginning of your talk when you spoke about the manic episode as being a creative resource. And I wondered about sort of the things that separate us economically, that for some strata of our society, mania is a creative resource. But for others, it's to be put away. It's to be jailed. It's to be gotten into a homeless shelter and medicated. I mean, it's a huge sort of cultural division there. So I was really struck by that, I have to say. Just a couple of comments. And the other is the incredibly heightened use of this diagnosis for children because of temper tantrums. Not because of a creative resource, but because of temper tantrums. So I wonder, you read your sentences about to heal so fast. I wanted to ask you to repeat them, because this relationship between mania and depression, the soul and creativity, and how we're moving so far away from a culture that, for all the reasons, is not tapping into soul and utilizing soul. And so we have all of this symptomatic things happening around us, pharmacology, all these reasons that are coming together. So just a couple of things that someone from the community wanted to put out there as far as observations. The deeper we dive, perhaps the higher we go creatively, but we don't allow the dive. Right? We don't allow the dive. So in that, my question would be, could you please read your sentences on to heal again? Thank you.
Well, I might prefer to email them to you than to read them again and put everybody through that, but I appreciate the thought. And I do want to respond to the mania as a resource, but only for some. I completely agree. I thank you for emphasizing that point. I was trying to say that this is the imaginary. This is how we think about it. These are the dominant images. This is not the reality for anybody, even Ted Turner, probably. But it's a built-up, repeated message that gets put out in the media. I think you probably noticed that all of the examples of manic, successful heroes were white. Did you also notice they were all men? So sometimes I ask, can you think of a black manic hero? Can you think of a woman manic hero? Who? Oh my God, that's too perfect. But she's like the person who's promoted this whole thing so much, so that's really very funny. I mean, not funny, haha, but yeah, no, that's perfect. Well, sometimes people say Oprah, but then another person will say, no, she's too warm and loving. Can't be warm and loving. It's a different tenor. And then sometimes people say Martha Stewart. And then people say, no, she's too mechanical and hard. So it's sort of it's the combination of emotionally social energy without the hard edge of Martha Stewart or the warm lovingness of Oprah. And it's very hard for a woman to give that impression that she's just right there. So it's very race specific. It's very gender specific. And it's also interesting in terms of the history of this, that back in the early 20th century, mood disorders were a female malady, and schizophrenia was a male malady. The female being mercurial and changeable sort of fit with the stereotype of a woman, and the schizophrenic sort of closed off, isolated, fit with the stereotype of a man. And now what's happened is that the valence has changed, and somehow men have been able to tap into an aspect of the bipolar imaginary. And please remember, I'm talking about an imaginary, not a real thing. And for anybody, it is, there's a certain way of, a certain point in all of this where you might be incredibly creative. It's not nothing, but try to optimize it. Get it when you need it, not when you don't need it. Get it just right, not too much, not too little. That's the fantasy. It's a fantasy that it can be optimized. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's and children, I think that the children thing is incredibly important. I haven't studied it. I would, if anybody is interested in studying it, I would suggest that it be looked at very carefully with respect to attention. I think that the bipolar diagnosis for children and the epidemic of attentional disorders are closely related because, well, it's a long story, and I haven't done research with kids, but it's incredibly important. And my college students, my gym instructor said, we used to have moods. One day we were up and one day we were down, and now we're all bipolar. He said. So it's moved from a kind of ordinary experience of moods going up and down to it's become much more rigidly encapsulated. But I'm trying to say it's not just the doctors and the pharmaceutical companies that are at work here.
I had a question, and I was wondering, since you were diagnosed and you were doing your work before and after, so you were diagnosed kind of in the middle, I was wondering how it's affected the way you've looked at your work. Has it changed at all?
That's a really sweet question. Thank you. Well, I will tell you that I really hesitated before putting that in the book, that I had the diagnosis, because of all the reasons you can well imagine, that it kind of undercuts your rationality. I teach underage children. Am I capable of being responsible for under the age of 18 or 21 children? What will my dean think? What will my colleagues think? It really gave me pause. But what encouraged me to go ahead were two things. One, I didn't see how I could explain the field work very well without explaining that was how I got to be in these situations, just like people would no doubt, anthropologists would be all over me. Well, how did you get in there? Why did they even talk to you? So I knew that kind of the word was going to get out. So I might as well just put it in the book. The second reason is that I have tenure. That's one of the aspects of why tenure is a good thing. I mean, I can't be fired. I can be, unless my work goes, all bad. But I would really hesitate if I didn't have tenure. And I say in the book also that, and I'll say it here, that after a talk like this, sometimes people in the audience, if it's a student audience, will feel a climate has been created, or a context has been created where at last they can talk about what they've experienced. And I've had students stand up and say, well, I have the diagnosis of such and so. And, because of that possibility, I, after that, always say, please don't do that. Please wait. Talk to me if you want. And let me help you figure out what your situation is, because it can be very damaging. I mean, that's the reality. I wish it weren't so, but it is. So I have worried about it. Of course, no one tells me. No one tells me. I look at you differently now. I don't really think you make sense. You're not able to, give a coherent argument. No one tells me. I do get very, well, I'm not going to try not to do it now, but I do get angry very quickly. And I, always, and I probably am injudicious in my remarks sometimes. Is that because I am diagnosed with bipolar disorder, or because I just have a hot temper and I, can't stand it when people say stupid stuff? I don't know. I mean, but now that I have said I have the diagnosis, people could easily be thinking, there that goes again. So I don't know. No one will tell me because of the stigma, this incredible stigma and the fear. It's like with race. If you're with an African-American person and you're not sure just how to handle it, you'll be quiet. You'll just be quiet. And so if you're with a person with bipolar disorder, and you're not quite sure how to handle it, you won't go there. And that's what happens. People don't go there. So
Hi. I wonder if you have studied other cultures and what have you noted traits within their culture as it relates to the incidence of their diagnosis of bipolar disorder, or how they might view it differently?
Great question. I haven't done a comparable study to this in another culture, although there are anthropologists now who are working in different parts of the world to try to do exactly that, which I value tremendously. So it's kind of would be a long answer to deal with all of that. But however, I worked in China for my first foreign, exotic, long-term field work, and I often think back to those times. That was in the 70s and 80s, and I wasn't thinking about these problems then, but there were the villages where I lived were very active with extrasensory experiences of all different kinds. People went into trance fairly frequently, visited the underworld, gods possessed people. So they had a wide variety of different kinds of states of being that were part of everyday life. And that were, because they lived in a world that was this world we see around us, the everyday world, and then the world of the dead, the world of the gods, the world of the spirits, just all kinds of, and this is the norm around most of the world. And so I often think, well, what would happen if and when, and maybe it has by now, this kind of diagnosis entered that scene? I mean, that's an interesting question. If I had my sort of vision experience and were a member of that community, maybe it would have meant something comprehensible. readily comprehensible. There was a woman in the village who was said to be crazy in the local term. There's a local term for being crazy. And he said it came and went with the seasons. And when the rice seedlings were sprouting, that's when she went crazy. But everyone knew that as soon as the seedlings were transplanted into the fields, it would be over with. And then she was fine, like the white spaces. So she was only a problem for part of the year, and they had a way of handling it. And then she was fine. So that's a very different kind of way of handling a perturbation. I had one more thing. I have a colleague at Princeton, Gananath Obiasekara, who's from Sri Lanka. And when I was at Princeton for many years, I sometimes be moping around the department, depressed, looking like, death warmed over. And he is a Buddhist, and he would take me aside and say, if you were a Buddhist, you would be gaining merit because your state is one of withdrawal from the world. And that is the goal of Buddhist practice. So he tried to get me to see it as virtuous or, full. I couldn't do it. I mean, I'm not sure that Buddhist practice and depression are quite comparable, but there was a way in which he gave me another language, at least, for thinking about it. I think this is an enormously productive cross-cultural, really deep cross-cultural exploration of the different kinds of meanings that these experiences can have. Not finding bipolar disorder in China, but finding out how Chinese communities handle, mood perturbations or unusual experiences.
We have one more question.
I wanted to go back to what you said about things having sped up. In the service of full disclosure, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I grew up with a father who was diagnosed as manic depressive psychotic. I mean, he was given the diagnosis of manic depressive psychosis in, I think, 1935, when there were no medications. And I'm sure that there were some biological precursors in his family, perhaps, although that wasn't really clear. But when he became fully manic, he had a job, he was a pharmacist, where 4 telephones were ringing all day long, where nurses were coming from doctor's offices in the building. Just, I think when he began preaching from this little balcony in the pharmacy where he filled prescriptions, I think they hired 3 people to replace him. And he had a lot of white spaces, but he also had 13 rather long hospitalizations because there were no medications, not even lithium, during his lifetime. So I wanted to just say that there do seem to be pressures that trigger the manic illness. I think he was 39. So he had lived all that time, had had his own drugstore, lost it during the Depression, and that was probably the first onslaught on his, equilibrium. But he still managed to be non-bipolar for at least 5 years after that and work productively as a pharmacist. So, and a footnote on Kay Redfield Jameson, I had occasion to look up her CV, and it's 25 pages long, single-spaced, talking about productivity and how much she has made out of her. But her book certainly says how important it was for her, at least, to stay on lithium and saved her life. So I just wanted to make that comment from personal experience. I see what you're saying about slowing down.
Thank you. That's a lovely story.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you so much, Freddie Ben.
Thank you.